Hi, my name's Evan LaGuardia, and this is the cultural impact of jazz on American culture. So we'll start off with the history of jazz. It originated in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the origin of this place was nicknamed Dixieland in its red light district. Um, and jazz's humble beginnings began from work songs on the Mississippi River and their riverboats, and they were composed of hums that matched the work rhythm. So jazz eventually turned into pop and rock and roll in the 60s and 70s, and those went on to influence rap and hip hop in the late 80s, early 90s. Louis Armstrong was one of the founding fathers of jazz. He made music in the red light district of New Orleans, and he eventually made his way up to Chicago during the Great Migration, and he was an influential figure on jazz in its entirety. Then we moved to Crazy Blues, which is a song by Mamie Smith, and it was originally called Harlem Blues, and it was the first ever hit jazz song that gained recognition from Columbia Records. So now we move to jazz and the civil rights movement. We start here in Harlem, where there's a renaissance and a cultural explosion of African Americans moving out of the South and coming up to big cities and urban areas in the North, where they escape their Jim Crow laws and have much more freedom, and they can express themselves through music in these northern states. The cultural explosion showed how jazz and African Americans are making their lasting impact on this nation, how everyone comes together and rejoices over jazz music. Detroit and Chicago were are the two main cities that jazz has migrated to out of the south of New Orleans. They migrated to Chicago and Detroit with the help of King Oliver. And then we move on to John Coltrane, and he helped African Americans by performing at civil liberty gatherings, which benefited the group by making them more popular. John Coltrane was never a man of sharing his political views, but he always made his presence known by performing at these gatherings. But on the other hand, Nina Simone, she wanted to use violence to obtain these civil liberties, and she wanted to create a separate black state. But in the end, nevertheless, she helped African Americans become fully free, although she did not use violence. Now we're moving on to pop culture and jazz's lasting effect on it. It starts off by jazz having its golden age during the 40s, 50s, and even early 60s. But eventually around this time, pop and rock became increasingly bigger, with the introduction of Elvis Presley becoming one of the biggest rock stars of all time during the 60s. He even mentioned that his music was inspired by African Americans and jazz in general. After Elvis, soon came along Michael Jackson, and he made pop music that has some flares of jazz in the background with their beats, but eventually he became a pop star, and he brought pop to its main stage, and it still lives on its main stage today. Jackson and Presley were both inspired by jazz music they listened to growing up, but eventually put their own spin on it and became celebrities in themselves. Before jazz went away completely, some TV shows and movies were using jazz music as their introduction music, or music to play in the background during the credits. And even some news stations use jazz to preview tonight's special features or the conclusion of their shows. So now we move on to the continued relevance of jazz in today's music. And jazz is found in production studios all over the United States in order to produce beats for rappers today, for them to rap over. A lot of beats use the snare drum, saxophone, and piano for their main sound. All these instruments are found in jazz music in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And actually, jazz is also used in demos and samples, which are previous existing pieces of music that are chopped and screwed with in order to create a different appearance in the song. Kanye West, for example, is one of the first of many to incorporate these samples in his music, in which he uses old jazz songs to introduce the song he makes. For example, Father Stretch My Hands Part 2 starts off with a slowed down jazz sample, and it turns into his hip hop / rap song that is a viral sensation today. The harmony and rhythm in jazz used in the 30s and 40s obviously advanced into today's music, but you could still kind of hear them in the background of these jazz songs rap songs as they play over your speakers. Then we move on to Kamasi Washington, and this man has been making music since the year 2000, and he plays the saxophone, and he is one of the only jazz musicians to play today. And they say he's the next spearhead of jazz, except he has yet to hit mainstream media or become a viral sensation in himself. But he does continue to produce jazz music in the modern day, even though it's not as popular as rap or hip hop or rock and roll for that matter, but it does show his connection to the music. So to conclude my presentation, the cultural impact of jazz on American culture starts off in Harlem with the civil rights movement, and it moves on to creating pop and rock and roll and creating the music that we know today as hip hop or rap music, and you can find jazz all throughout. But going back to Harlem, jazz really helped free the slaves through the celebrities at the time, John Coltrane and Nina Simone. And today, jazz is still used in production studios, and rappers still use jazz in order to create their music and find inspiration for themselves.